Evicted into poverty, how housing instability creates economic inequality. In January of 2008, a Milwaukee landlord kicked down the door of Arlene Bell and her two sons and locked them out of their apartment in the middle of winter. Arlene had nowhere to go. She took her boys to the Salvation Army shelter, a 120-bed facility on Milwaukee's north side, and from there began a cycle of displacement that would consume the next several years of her life. Her story, documented in Matthew Desmond's Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City, is not an outlier, it is the standard. Between 2009 and 2011, roughly 1 in 8 Milwaukee renters experienced a forced move. Across the country, more than 1 in 5 poor renting families spend over half their income on housing costs, leaving little for food, healthcare savings, or childcare. When that balance collapses, as it does so often, the consequences extend far beyond the loss of a roof. Eviction is not just a symptom of poverty, but rather a driving force of it. Americans need to understand housing instability as a structural cause of economic inequality rather than a personal failure. The common assumption about poverty is that it stems from failures on the part of the impoverished individual, such as poor financial decisions, lack of education, and insufficient work ethic. This narrative is comfortable because it places responsibility on the poor themselves and absolves the system and the wealthier from blame. But the evidence tells a different story. As Desmond writes, poverty is two faced, a matter of income and expenses. Low income families are being drained by a housing market that extracts a large profit from their desperation. Although eviction is widely understood as something that happens to people who are already poor, it is a structural force that actively produces poverty by stripping families of jobs, savings, neighborhoods, and futures, and could be addressed through sweeping reforms to how this country funds and regulates housing. The most immediate driver of housing instability is the large cost of rent relative to income. In Milwaukee's poorest neighborhoods, Desmond found that renters were spending 70 to 80% of their income on rent alone, which left less than a fifth of their earnings for every other necessity in life. This is not a localized phenomenon. The National Low Income Housing Coalition reported in recent years that there is no state in the country where a full time minimum wage worker can afford a modest two-bedroom apartment. Nationally, low income families are caught in what economists call a rent burden, defined as spending more than 30% of income on housing. For millions, the burden is far more extreme than that threshold suggests. When rent consumes most of a family's budget, any disruption, a missed shift, a medical bill, a broken down car, can spiral toward eviction. Arlene Bell's $550 a month rent represented the going rate for a two-bedroom apartment in one of America's poorest neighborhoods in 2008, utilities not included. She received a welfare check and had no room for error. When the check was delayed or when unexpected expenses arose, she fell behind. Her landlord, Sharina Tarver, filed for eviction. This is not cruelty for its own sake. It is the logic of a market that has learned to profit from poverty. Sharina herself acknowledged that the inner city was her most reliable source of income, preying on tenants who had nowhere else to go. Conventional view treats eviction as something that happens to people who are already poor. Desmond's research overturns this assumption. Eviction, he argues, is itself a primary cause of deepening poverty, not merely its result. When families are evicted, they can lose their possessions, which are often abandoned amid the chaos of a forced move. They lose their jobs because displacement can disrupt transportation and sometimes the basic psychological stability required to show up for work. They lose access to their children's schools, their social networks, and the neighborhoods that provided any measure of community. Desmond documents how Lamar, a disabled Vietnam veteran navigating life in a wheelchair, lost his SSI payments due to address disruptions following his eviction. A single forced move had unraveled any sense of stability he had. The data Desmond gathered confirms what individual stories suggest. Eviction is associated with job loss, depression, and long term material hardship at rates significantly higher than for families with comparable circumstances who were not evicted. It forces families into worse housing in more dangerous neighborhoods because an eviction record, which is visible to all future landlords, marks people as risks, making it nearly impossible to secure decent housing afterwards. The eviction record functions as a kind of scarlet letter, shutting doors and leaving people disadvantaged for years. As Desmond observes, eviction does not simply drop poor families into a dark alley, it redirects the entire trajectory of their lives. Children bear a particularly heavy share of this burden. Families evicted with children are compelled to move repeatedly, disrupting schooling and stripping away the friendships, teachers, and stable routines that support healthy development. Research cited in Desmond's epilogue documents that children and families that experience eviction show lasting deficits in educational attainment and social adjustment. These are not temporary setbacks, they are the early chapters of intergenerational poverty. Housing instability does not fall equally on all Americans. It is concentrated by race, gender, and geography in ways that reveal the structural aspects of the problem. Black women, Desmond found, are evicted at rates disproportionate to the share of their renting population. In Milwaukee, they accounted for the largest group of evicted tenants. This is not incidental. It reflects the intersection of residential segregation and predatory landlord practices in neighborhoods that have been systematically manipulated. Milwaukee's north side, where much of Evicted takes place, lost more than half its manufacturing jobs between the 1970s and the 1990s as deindustrialization swept through the Rust Belt. What remained was a neighborhood of cheap properties and desperate tenants, an ideal combination for landlords willing to collect high rents relative to property values, all while deferring maintenance in the process. Shireen at Harvard built a portfolio of 36 units precisely by exploiting this dynamic. This points to something larger than individual landlord greed. The American housing market has been constructed over decades of policy choices that prioritize resources to homeowners while leaving renters to fend for themselves. Desmond notes that in 2008, the federal government spent roughly $171 billion dollars on homeowner tax benefits, such as the mortgage interest deduction and capital gains exclusions, compared to far less on direct housing assistance for the poor. This is a policy choice, not a natural condition. Critics of housing intervention argue that the market left alone will correct imbalances over time, and that restricting landlords' abilities to change market rates or evict tenants will reduce the housing supply by discouraging investment. Rent control, when poorly designed, can freeze units out of the rental market and create long waiting lists rather than expanding availability. Desmond himself does not advocate for rent control. The solution he proposes is a universal housing voucher program which works with the market rather than against it, giving low income families with the financial power to compete for decent housing rather than capping what landlords can charge. The idea that poverty is ultimately a problem of individual behavior is harder to sustain after reading Evicted. Arlene Bell was not poor because she made bad choices. She was poor because the wages available to her were insufficient. The housing market offered her nothing affordable, and every time she came close to stabilizing her situation, a missed payment or a landlord's decision to sell knocked her back down. Lamar was not disabled and evicted because of personal failure either. He was navigating a system that provided him with just enough support to survive, but not enough to achieve stability. It is impossible to ignore the structural forces that shape the options available to the lower class in the first place. Path forward requires treating housing as a foundational right without which all other rights become hollow. Desmond proposes a universal housing voucher program that would give every low income family in America a voucher to spend in the private rental market, with the government covering the gap between what a family can reasonably afford and the fair market rent in their area. The Netherlands, Great Britain, and other wealthy democracies have implemented similar housing assistance and mobility programs with positive effects on family stability, child outcomes, and long term economic mobility. Beyond vouchers, the legal system could be reformed to give tenants better protection. Today, the vast majority of tenants in eviction court appear without legal representation, while most landlords have lawyers. Because of this, it is difficult for the poor to get a fair trial in the face of this disparity. Providing legal aid to low income tenants in eviction proceedings might begin to fix this. We must also confront the racial dimensions of housing instability directly. Exclusionary zoning and discriminatory lending are part of what makes eviction so damaging. A genuine commitment to change is addressing these core issues, not merely responding to the symptoms they produce. Arlene Bell's wish, expressed near the end of Evicted, that she wished my life were different. I wish that when I be an old lady, I can sit back and look at my kids, and they be grown, and they, become something more than me. That wish is not radical. It is the most fundamental aspiration that poverty denies. Housing instability destroys the conditions under which it might be realized, trapping families in cycles of poverty. If we are serious about addressing economic inequality, we should not continue to treat housing as a private matter beyond the reaches of policy. Affordable, stable housing is the foundation on which everything else in a dignified and respected life is built. Until we provide that foundation for all Americans, we are allowing this suffering to continue.